keenly want to know what you think about the stories that have been coming in of late, Richard, about apparent drone attacks on Russian territory. There was a drone carrying, it seems, explosives. It fell about 100 kilometers from Moscow, and reports of other what are called unidentified flying objects falling near, in one case, an oil refinery, a farm in southwest Russia. What's your take on that? Is there any reason, in principle, in warfare, why Ukraine should not be striking these targets in Russia?
There's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be doing it. Of course, the West and the United States in particular have been at pains to try and prevent some of the weaponry, the HIMARS missiles, being of a sufficient range that could reach well into Russia. ATACMS, which is the longer range missile, has hitherto been denied to the Ukrainians. But of course, the Ukrainians have shown several times during this campaign that they are very innovative, which actually war makes you. But this made them very innovative to find ways of extending the range of other munitions that they've got so that they can legitimately carry the war into Russian territory. And after all, there's no point getting too carried away with this. I mean, the whole war currently is being conducted by Russia on Ukrainian territory. So it's not totally unreasonable that Ukraine themselves, using whatever devices they can make, carry the attacks occasionally onto Russian territory. We saw it in Crimea, of course, as well.
Yes, which, of course, is a Ukraine territory, which was seized by Russia back in 2014. And the key, of course, is to avoid drawing NATO into direct confrontation with Russia, and that can be avoided.
Yes, that's absolutely right. It's one thing, we've all been saying this all the way along, it's one thing for NATO countries and other Western countries to supply arms, equipment, training, ammunition, and know-how to the Ukrainians, but it's quite a different matter for NATO member states, soldiers, to get involved directly. And hitherto, we've quite successfully and quite properly managed to ensure that that is not the case. So yes, NATO is being very clear, particularly clear about its deterrent defensive posture to make sure that any other aspirations that Mr. Putin might have, which of course he originally stated at the start of all this, that he wanted to roll back history of the last decade or so. And NATO is maintaining an increased number of forward deterrent deployments in countries like Poland and the Baltic states, and so on and so forth.
I'm just interested in your view too, Richard, on the information war, because I was just reading an analysis of the way that China and Russia are working very closely together on the information war, on disinformation about what is happening on the ground in this conflict. And that is important. China, we know they want to send a message to potential friends and allies, especially in the southern hemisphere of the globe. And they may or may not be supplying Russia with munitions and weaponry now, but they are helping in that respect. And it is something of an alert, isn't it, for the West and for Ukraine's friends?
Well, yes, we've been saying all along that this is a limited war as far as geography is concerned. The war is contained within Ukraine by and large, limited objectives and a limit on means. The nuclear issue is very much a limit. But of course, the wider war is the battle for support, and that comes from information, comes from disinformation. And we see, in a sense, Russia being quite successful with the way that many African countries are at best sitting on the fence, or at worst actually supporting Russia.
Yeah.
And I think inevitably you're going to get psychological operations, information, disinformation. I think there's one other dimension, John, if you've got a moment, and that is as far as the link between Russia and China is concerned. I think there's a growing belief that China is saying, and has been saying very clearly to Russia, don't you even think about going down the nuclear route?
Yes, they were explicit about that, I think, in their 12 points.
Well, I think it's a really important aspect of the relationship between China and Russia. And Russia really needs China. Russia is the junior partner now in that relationship between Russia and China. And therefore, Putin has to listen to President Xi on the nuclear issue and take the very firm warnings that he should not think about using nuclear weapons, because the wider consequences for the war, for the world, are considerable. And I think Vladimir Putin is taking careful note of that.
That's an important point. What is your latest thinking on the war itself, on the ground? I mean, we know there is now ferocious fighting around the town of Bakhmut, which is symbolically important and also strategically important. But there has been no enormous push by Russia. They haven't used their air power, although their air power is pretty much intact. And there was a lot of expectation that there may be a change in that direction, but it hasn't happened, Richard.
We haven't seen, I don't believe, the full Russian fresh offensive yet. Yes, you're absolutely right. Around Bakhmut and that central area, they're continuing to press, I mean, with huge casualties and huge loss of life. And of course, and the Ukrainians are taking casualties as well. But critically, they have hung on to the territory in that central region, with the Russians losing a very large number of their poorly trained, hastily conscripted soldiers. I think we will see another offensive. This is only the beginnings of it. It may not come until the weather has begun to improve. And the Ukrainians are braced for that. And of course, well, on the evidence of all that we've seen so far, the Russian new offensive is very likely to fail. And as I said so many times, that is the moment for the Ukrainians, when the better weather comes, to mount their concerted spring offensive using the modern weaponry, main battle tanks and the like, that we are now supplying them.
Yes, I mean, Ukraine is well equipped, thanks to their many friends in the West, in Europe and in NATO. When it comes to fighting manpower, we're still, I suppose, looking into something of a mist, aren't we? The Russian side, you can't believe a word they say about their losses. I saw an estimate of maybe 188,000 Russian killed and injured and missing since the start of the invasion. They sent 150,000 troops in at the start of this war. On the Ukrainian side, we don't know. So it's hard to gauge how each side measures up when it comes to fighting manpower.
You're right. I think the figure of between 180 and 190,000 Russian killed, injured, or missing is a fairly well substantiated figure. That's being quoted by quite a number of sources. We don't know on the Ukrainian side, because they're being understandably very wary about numbers, but it's probably in that sort of six-figure, 100,000 figure. Of course, the big question is, with a Russian population 3 times the size of Ukraine, who can sustain these losses for the longest? I mean, that is why, once again, it's really important that the Western equipment, main battle tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled guns, are all made available to the Ukrainians as quickly as possible, so that they can mount this concerted counteroffensive in the late spring, early summer, and give themselves the chance of striking decisive blows on the Russians, breaking the back of the Russian army, breaking the Russian soldiers' morale, and winning this war on the battlefield this year.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.